This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 19. A Strange Wedding. One person, however, did not succeed in getting out in time before the gates were shut, and that was the High Priest Agon, who, as we had every reason to believe, was Sorais' great ally and the heart and soul of her party. This cunning and ferocious old man had not forgiven us for those hippopotami, or rather, that is what he said. What he meant was that he would never brook the introduction of our wider ways of thought and foreign learning and influence while there was a possibility of stamping us out. Also, he knew that we possessed a different system of religion, and no doubt was in daily terror of our attempting to introduce it into Zu-Vendis. One day he asked me if we had any religion in our country, and I told him that so far as I could remember we had 95 different ones. You might have knocked him down with a feather. And really it is difficult not to pity a high priest of a well-established cult who is haunted by the possible approach of one or all of 95 new religions. When we knew that Agon was caught, Nyleptha, Sir Henry and I discussed what was to be done with him. I was for closely incarcerating him, but Nyleptha shook her head, saying that it would produce a disastrous effect throughout the country. "Ah," she added, with a stamp of her foot, "if I win and am once really queen, I will break the power of those priests, with their rites and reveals and dark secret ways." I only wish that old Agon could have heard her. It would have frightened him. "Well," said Sir Henry, "if we are not to imprison him, I suppose that we may as well let him go. He is of no use here." Nyleptha looked at him in a curious sort of way, and said in a dry little voice, "Thinkest thou so, my lord?" "Eh?" said Curtis. "No, I do not see what is the use of keeping him." She said nothing, but continued looking at him in a way that was as shy as it was sweet. Then at last he understood. "Forgive me, Nyleptha," he said rather tremulously. "Dost thou mean that thou wilt marry me even now?" "Nay, I know not. Let my lord say," was her rapid answer. "But if my lord wills, the priest is there and the altar is there," pointing to the entrance to a private chapel. "And am I not ready to do the will of my lord? Listen, O my lord. In 8 days or less thou must leave me and go down to war, for thou shalt lead my armies, and in war men sometimes fall, and so I would for a little space have had thee all my own, if only for memory's sake," and the tears overflowed her lovely eyes, and rolled down her face like heavy drops of dew down the red heart of a rose. "Mayhap, too," she went on, "I shall lose my crown, and with my crown my life, and thine also. Sorais is very strong and very bitter, and if she prevails she will not spare. Who can read the future? Happiness is the world's white bird that alights seldom and flies fast and far, till one day he is lost in the clouds. Therefore should we hold him fast if by any chance he rests for a little space upon our hand. It is not wise to neglect the present for the future, for who knows what the future will be, Incubu? Let us pluck our flowers while the dew is on them, for when the sun is up they wither, and on the morrow will others bloom that we shall never see." And she lifted her sweet face to him and smiled into his eyes, and once more I felt a curious pang of jealousy and turned and went away. They never took much notice of whether I was there or not, thinking, I suppose, that I was an old fool, and that it did not matter one way or the other, and really I believe that they were right. So I went back to our quarters and ruminated over things in general, and watched old Umslopogaas whetting his axe outside the window as a vulture whets his beak beside a dying ox. And in about an hour's time Sir Henry came tearing over, looking very radiant and wildly excited, and found Good and myself and even Umslopogaas, and asked us if we should like to assist at a real wedding. Of course we said yes, and off we went to the chapel, where we found Agon looking as sulky as any high priest possibly could, and no wonder. It appeared that he and Nyleptha had a slight difference of opinion about the coming ceremony. He had flatly refused to celebrate it, or to allow any of his priests to do so, whereupon Nyleptha became very angry and told him that she, as queen, was head of the church and meant to be obeyed. Indeed, she played the part of a Zu-Vendi Henry VIII to perfection, and insisted that if she wanted to be married, she would be married, and that he should marry her. End note. In Zu-Vendis, members of the royal house can only be married by the high priest or a formally appointed deputy. Allan Quatermain. He still refused to go through the ceremony, so she clinched her argument thus: "Well, I cannot execute a high priest because there is an absurd prejudice against it, and I cannot imprison him because all his subordinates would raise a crying that would bring the stars down on Zu-Vendis and crush it. But I can leave him to contemplate the altar of the sun without anything to eat, because that is his natural vocation. And if thou wilt not marry me, O Agon, thou shalt be placed before the altar yonder with naught but a little water, till such time as thou hast reconsidered the matter." Now, as it happened, Agon had been hurried away that morning without his breakfast, and was already exceedingly hungry. So he presently modified his views and consented to marry them, saying at the same time that he washed his hands of all responsibility in the matter. So it chanced that presently, attended only by two of her favourite maidens, came the Queen Nyleptha, with happy blushing face and downcast eyes, dressed in pure white, without embroidery of any sort, as seems to be the fashion on these occasions in most countries of the world. She did not wear a single ornament, even her gold circlets were removed, and I thought that if possible she looked more lovely than ever without them, as really superbly beautiful women do. She came, curtsied low to Sir Henry, and then took his hand and led him up before the altar, and after a little pause, in a slow, clear voice, uttered the following words, which are customary in Zu-Vendis if the bride desires and the man consents: "Thou dost swear by the sun that thou wilt take no other woman to wife unless I lay my hand upon her and bid her come?" "I swear it," answered Sir Henry, adding in English, "one is quite enough for me." Then Agon, who had been sulking in a corner near the altar, came forward and gabbled off something into his beard at such a rate that I could not follow it, but it appeared to be an invocation to the sun to bless the union and make it fruitful. I observed that Nyleptha listened very closely to every word, and afterwards discovered that she was afraid lest Agon should play a trick, and by going through the invocations backwards divorce them instead of marry them. At the end of the invocations they were asked, as in our service, if they took each other for husband and wife, and on their assenting they kissed each other before the altar, and the service was over so far as their rights were concerned. But it seemed to me that there was yet something wanting, and so I produced a prayer book which has, together with the Ingoldsby Legends that I often read when I lie awake at night, accompanied me in all my later wanderings. I gave it to my poor boy Harry years ago, and after his death I found it among his things and took it back again. "Curtis," I said, "I am not a clergyman, and I do not know if what I am going to propose is allowable. I know it is not legal, but if you and the Queen have no objection, I should like to read the English marriage service over you. It is a solemn step which you are taking, and I think that you ought, so far as circumstances will allow, to give it the sanction of your own religion." "I have thought of that," he said, "and I wish you would. I do not feel half married yet." Nyleptha raised no objection, fully understanding that her husband wished to celebrate the marriage according to the rites prevailing in his own country, and so I set to work and read the service from "Dearly Beloved" to "Amazement" as well as I could, and when I came to "I, Henry, take thee, Nyleptha," I translated, and also "I, Nyleptha, take thee, Henry," which she repeated after me very well. Then Sir Henry took a plain gold ring from his little finger and placed it on hers, and so on to the end. The ring had been Curtis's mother's wedding ring, and I could not help thinking how astonished the old Yorkshire lady would have been if she could have foreseen that her wedding ring was to serve a similar purpose for Nyleptha, a queen of the Zu-Vendi. As for Agon, he was with difficulty kept calm while this second ceremony was going on, for he at once understood that it was religious in its nature, and doubtless bethought him of the 95 new faiths which loomed so ominously in his eyes. Indeed, he at once set me down as a rival high priest, and hated me accordingly. However, in the end off he went, positively bristling with indignation, and I knew that we might look out for danger from his direction. And off went Good and I, and old Umslopogaas also, leaving the happy pair to themselves, and very low we all felt. Marriages are supposed to be cheerful things, but my experience is that they are very much the reverse to everybody, except perhaps the two people chiefly interested. They mean the breaking up of so many old ties as well as the undertaking of so many new ones, and there was always something sad about the passing away of the old order. Now to take this case for instance. Sir Henry Curtis is the best and kindest fellow and friend in the world, but he has never been quite the same since that little scene in the chapel. It is always Nyleptha this and Nyleptha that, Nyleptha, in short, from morning till night in one way or another, either expressed or understood. And as for the old friends, well, of course they have taken the place that old friends ought to take, and which ladies are as a rule very careful to see they do take when a man marries, and that is the second place. Yes, he would be angry if anybody said so, but it is a fact for all that. He is not quite the same, and Nyleptha is very sweet and very charming, but I think that she likes him to understand that she has married him and not Quatermain, Good and company. But there, what is the use of grumbling? It is all very right and proper, as any married lady would have no difficulty in explaining, and I am a selfish, jealous old man, though I hope I never show it. So Good and I went and ate in silence, and then indulged in an extra fine flagon of old Zu-Vendian to keep our spirits up, and presently one of our attendants came and told a story that gave us something to think about. It may, perhaps, be remembered that after his quarrel with Umslopogaas, Alphonse had gone off in an exceedingly ill temper to sulk over his scratches. Well, it appears that he had walked right past the Temple to the Sun, down the wide road on the further side of the slope it crowns, and thence on into the beautiful park or pleasure gardens which are laid out just beyond the outer wall. After wandering there for a little he started to return, but was met near the outer gate by Sorais' train of chariots, which were galloping furiously along the great northern road. When she caught sight of Alphonse, Sorais halted her train and called to him. On approaching he was instantly seized and dragged into one of the chariots and carried off, crying out loudly, as our informant said, and from my general knowledge of him I can well believe. At first I was much puzzled to know what object Sorais could have had in carrying off the poor little Frenchman. She could hardly stoop so low as to try to wreak her fury on one whom she knew was only a servant. At last, however, an idea occurred to me. We three were, as I think I have said, much revered by the people of Zu Vendis at large, both because we were the first strangers they had ever seen, and because we were supposed to be the possessors of almost supernatural wisdom. Indeed, though Sorais' cry against the foreign wolves, or to translate it more accurately, foreign hyenas, was sure to go down very well with the nobles and the priests, it was not, as we learnt, likely to be particularly effectual amongst the bulk of the population. The Zu Vendi people, like the Athenians of old, are ever seeking for some new thing, and just because we were so new our presence was on the whole acceptable to them. Again, Sir Henry's magnificent personal appearance made a deep impression upon a race who possess a greater love of beauty than any other I have ever been acquainted with. Beauty may be prized in other countries, but in Zu Vendis it is almost worshipped, as indeed the national love of statuary shows. The people said openly in the marketplaces that there was not a man in the country to touch Curtis in personal appearance, as with the exception of Sorais there was no woman who could compete with Nyleptha, and that therefore it was meet that they should marry, and that he had been sent by the sun as a husband for their queen. Now from all this it will be seen that the outcry against us was to a considerable extent fictitious, and nobody knew it better than Sorais herself. Consequently it struck me that it might have occurred to her that down in the country and among the country people it would be better to place the reason of her conflict with her sister upon other and more general grounds than Nyleptha's marriage with the stranger. It would be easy in a land where there had been so many civil wars to rake out some old cry that would stir up the recollection of buried feuds, and indeed she soon found an effectual one. This being so, it was of great importance to her to have one of the strangers with her whom she could show to the common people as a great outlander who had been so struck by the justice of her cause that he had elected to leave his companions and follow her standard. This, no doubt, was the cause of her anxiety to get a hold of Good, whom she would have used till he ceased to be of service, and then cast off. But Good having drawn back, she grasped at the opportunity of securing Alphonse, who was not unlike him in personal appearance, though smaller, no doubt with the object of showing him off in the cities and country as the great Bougwan himself. I told Good that I thought that that was her plan, and his face was a sight to see, he was so horrified at the idea. "What," he said, "dress up that little wretch to represent me? Why, I should have to get out of the country. My reputation will be ruined for ever." I consoled him as well as I could, but it is not pleasant to be personated all over a strange country by an arrant little coward, and I can quite sympathize with his vexation. Well, that night Good and I messed, as I have said, in solitary grandeur, feeling very much as though we had just returned from burying a friend instead of marrying one, and next morning the work began in good earnest. The messages and orders which had been dispatched by Nyleptha 2 days before now began to take effect, and multitudes of armed men came pouring into the city. We saw, as may be imagined, but very little of Nyleptha, and not too much of Curtis during those next few days, but Good and I sat daily with the council of generals and loyal lords, drawing up plans of action, arranging commissariat matters, the distribution of commands, and 101 other things. Men came in freely, and all the day long the great roads leading to Milosis were spotted with the banners of lords arriving from their distant places to rally round Nyleptha. After the first few days it became clear that we should be able to take the field with about 40,000 infantry and 20,000 cavalry, a very respectable force considering how short was the time we had to collect it, and that about half the regular army had elected to follow Sorais. But if our force was large, Sorais's was, according to the reports brought in day by our spies, much larger. She had taken up her headquarters at a very strong town called Marstuna, situated, as I have said, to the north of Milosis, and all the countryside was flocking to her standard. Nasta had poured down from his highlands and was on his way to join her with no less than 25,000 of his mountaineers, the most terrible soldiers to face in all Zu Vendis. Another mighty lord, named Belusha, who lived in the great horse-breeding district, had come in with 12,000 cavalry, and so on. Indeed, what between one thing and another, it seemed certain that she would gather a fully armed host of nearly 100,000 men. And then came news that Sorais was proposing to break up her camp and march on the frowning city itself, desolating the country as she came. Thereon arose the question whether it would be best to meet her at Milosis or to go out and give her battle. When our opinion was asked upon the subject, Good and I unhesitatingly gave it in favour of an advance. If we were to shut ourselves up in the city and wait to be attacked, it seemed to us that our inaction would be set down to fear. It is so very important, especially on an occasion of this sort, when a very little will suffice to turn men's opinions one way or the other, to be up and doing something. Ardour for a cause will soon evaporate if the cause does not move but sits down to conquer. Therefore we cast our vote for moving out and giving battle in the open, instead of waiting till we were drawn from our walls like a badger from a hole. Sir Henry's opinion coincided with ours, and so, needless to say, did that of Nyleptha, who, like a flint, was always ready to flash out fire. A great map of the country was brought and spread out before her. About 30 miles this side of Marstuna, where Sorais lay, and 90-odd miles from Milosis, the road ran over a neck of land some 2½ miles in width, and flanked on either side by forest-clad hills, which, without being lofty, would, if the road were blocked, be quite impracticable for a great baggage-laden army to cross. She looked earnestly at the map, and then, with a quickness of perception that in some women amounts almost to an instinct, She laid her finger upon this neck of rising ground, and turning to her husband said with a proud air of confidence and a toss of the golden head, "Here shalt thou meet Sorais' armies. I know the spot. Here shalt thou meet them, and drive them before thee like dust before the storm." But Curtis looked grave and said nothing. End of chapter 19. Recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 20. The Battle of the Pass. It was on the third morning after this incident of the map that Sir Henry and I started. With the exception of a small guard, all the great host had moved on the night before, leaving the frowning city very silent and empty. Indeed, it was found impossible to leave any garrison, with the exception of a personal guard for Nyleptha, and about 1,000 men who, from sickness or one cause or another, were unable to proceed with the army. But as Milosis was practically impregnable, and as our enemy was in front of and not behind us, this did not so much matter. Good and Umslopogaas had gone on with the army, but Nyleptha accompanied Sir Henry and myself to the city gates, riding a magnificent white horse called Daylight, which was supposed to be the fleetest and most enduring animal in Zu-Vendis. Her face bore traces of recent weeping, but there were no tears in her eyes now. Indeed, she was bearing up bravely against what must have been a bitter trial to her. At the gate she reined in her horse and bade us farewell. On the previous day she had reviewed and addressed the officers of the great army, speaking to them such high, eloquent words, and expressing so complete a confidence in their valour and in their ultimate victory, that she quite carried their hearts away, and as she rode from rank to rank they cheered her till the ground shook. And now today the same mood seemed to be on her. "Fare thee well, Macumazahn," she said. "Remember, I trust to thy wits, which are as a needle to a spear handle compared to those of my people, to save us from Sorais. I know that thou wilt do thy duty." I bowed and explained to her my horror of fighting, and my fear lest I should lose my head, at which she laughed gently and turned to Curtis. "Fare thee well, my lord," she said. "Come back with victory and as a king, or on thy soldiers' spears." End note. Alluding to the Zu-Vendi custom of carrying dead officers on a framework of spears. Sir Henry said nothing, but turned his horse to go. Perhaps he had a bit of a lump in his throat. One gets over it afterwards, but these sort of partings are trying when one has only been married a week. "Here," added Nyleptha, "will I greet thee when ye return in triumph. And now, my lords, once more farewell." Then we rode on. But when we had gone 150 yards or so, we turned and perceived her still sitting on her horse at the same spot, and looking out after us beneath her hand, and that was the last we saw of her. About a mile farther on, however, we heard galloping behind us, and looking round saw a mounted soldier coming towards us, leading Nyleptha's matchless steed, Daylight. "The Queen sends the white stallion as a farewell gift to her lord Incubu, and bids me tell my lord that he is the fleetest and most enduring horse in all the land," said the soldier, bending to his saddle bow before us. At first Sir Henry did not want to take the horse, saying that he was too good for such rough work, but I persuaded him to do so, thinking that Nyleptha would be hurt if he did not. Little did I guess at the time what service that noble horse would render in our sorest need. It is curious to look back and realise upon what trivial and apparently coincidental circumstances great events frequently turn as easily and naturally as a door on its hinges. Well, we took the horse, and a beauty he was. It was a perfect pleasure to see him move. And Curtis having sent back his greetings and thanks, we proceeded on our journey. By midday we overtook the rear guard of the great army of which Sir Henry then formally took over the command. It was a heavy responsibility, and it oppressed him very much, but the Queen's injunctions on the point were such as did not admit of being trifled with. He was beginning to find out that greatness has its responsibilities as well as its glories. Then we marched on without meeting any opposition, almost indeed without seeing anybody, for the populations of the towns and villages along our route had for the most part fled, fearing lest they should be caught between the two rival armies and ground to powder like grain between the upper and nether stones. On the evening of the fourth day, for the progress of so great a multitude was necessarily slow, we camped 2 miles this side of the neck or ridge I have spoken of, and our outposts brought us word that Sorais with all her power was rolling down upon us, and had pitched her camp that night 10 miles the farther side of the neck. Accordingly, before dawn we sent forward 1,500 cavalry to seize the position. Scarcely had they occupied it, however, before they were attacked by about as many of Sorais' horsemen, and a very smart little cavalry fight ensued, with a loss to us of about 30 men killed. On the advance of our supports, however, Sorais' force drew off, carrying their dead and wounded with them. The main body of the army reached the neck about dinner time, and I must say that Nyleptha's judgment had not failed her. It was an admirable place to give battle in, especially to a superior force. The road ran down a mile or more through ground too broken to admit of the handling of any considerable force, till it reached the crest of a great green wave of land that rolled down a gentle slope to the banks of a little stream, and then rolled away again up a still gentler slope to the plain beyond, the distance from the crest of the land wave down to the stream being a little over half a mile, and from the stream up to the plain beyond a trifle less. The length of this wave of land at its highest point, which corresponded exactly with the width of the neck of the land between the wooded hills, was about 2 miles and a quarter, and it was protected on either side by dense, rocky, bush-clad ground that afforded a most valuable cover to the flanks of the army, and rendered it almost impossible for them to be turned. It was on the hither slope of this neck of land that Curtis encamped his army, in the same formation that he had, after consultation with the various generals, Good and myself, determined that they should occupy in the great pitched battle which now appeared to be imminent. Our force of 60,000 men was, roughly speaking, divided as follows. In the centre was a dense body of 20,000 foot soldiers, armed with spears, swords, and hippopotamus hide shields, breast and backplates. End note. The Zu-Vendi people do not use bows. Allan Quatermain. These formed the chest of the army, and were supported by 5,000 foot and 3,000 horse in reserve. On either side of this chest were stationed 7,000 horse arranged in deep majestic squadrons, and beyond and on either side but slightly in front of them again were two bodies, each numbering about 7,500 spearmen, forming the right and left wings of the army, and each supported by a contingent of some 1,500 cavalry. This makes in all 60,000 men. Curtis commanded in chief. I was in command of the 7,000 horse between the chest and right wing, which was commanded by Good, and the other battalions and squadrons were entrusted to Zu-Vendis generals. Scarcely had we taken up our positions before Sorais' vast army began to swarm on the opposite slope about a mile in front of us, till the whole place seemed alive with the multitude of her spear points, and the ground shook with the tramp of her battalions. It was evident that the spies had not exaggerated. We were outnumbered by at least a third. At first we expected that Sorais was going to attack us at once, as the clouds of cavalry which hung upon her flanks executed some threatening demonstrations. But she thought better of it, and there was no fight that day. As for the formation of her great forces, I cannot now describe it with accuracy, and it would only serve to bewilder if I did. But I may say generally that in its leading features it resembled our own, only her reserve was much greater. Opposite our right wing, and forming Sorais' left wing, was a great army of dark, wild-looking men, armed with sword and shield only, which I was informed was composed of Nasta's 25,000 savage hillsmen. "My word, Good," said I when I saw them, "you will catch it tomorrow when those gentlemen charge," whereat Good, not unnaturally, looked rather anxious. All day we watched and waited, but nothing happened, and at last night fell, and 1,000 watchfires twinkled brightly on the slopes, to wane and die one by one like the stars they resembled. As the hours wore on, the silence gradually gathered more deeply over the opposing hosts. It was a very wearying night, for in addition to the endless things that had to be attended to, there was our gnawing suspense to reckon with. The fray which tomorrow would witness would be so vast, and the slaughter so awful, that stout indeed must the heart have been that was not overwhelmed at the prospect. And when I thought of all that hung upon it, I own I felt ill, and it made me very sad to reflect that these mighty forces were gathered for destruction simply to gratify the jealous anger of a woman. This was the hidden power which was to send those dense masses of cavalry flashing like human thunderbolts across the plain, and to roll together the fierce battalions as clouds when hurricane meets hurricane. It was a dreadful thought, and set one wondering about the responsibilities of the great ones of the earth. Deep into the night we sat, with pale faces and heavy hearts, and took counsel, whilst the sentries tramped up and down, down and up, and the armed and plumed generals came and went, grim and shadow-like. And so the time wore away, till everything was ready for the coming slaughter, and I lay down and thought, and tried to get a little rest, but could not sleep for fear of the morrow, for who could say what the morrow would bring forth? Misery and death, this was certain. Beyond that we knew not, and I confess I was very much afraid. But as I realized then, it is useless to question that eternal sphinx, the future, From day to day she reads aloud the riddles of the yesterday, of which the puzzled worldlings of all ages have not answered one, nor ever will, guess they never so wildly, or cry they never so loud. And so at length I gave up wondering, being forced humbly to leave the issue in the balancing hands of Providence and the morrow. And at last up came the red sun, and the huge camps awoke with a clash and a roar, and gathered themselves together for battle. It was a beautiful and awe-inspiring scene, and old Umslopogaas, leaning on his axe, contemplated it with grim delight. "Never have I seen the like, Macumazahn, never," he said. "The battles of my people are as the play of children to what this will be. Thinkest thou that they will fight it out?" "Ay," I answered sadly, "to the death. Content thyself, woodpecker, for once shalt thou peck thy fill." Time went on, and still there was no sign of an attack. A force of cavalry crossed the brook, indeed, and rode slowly along our front, evidently taking stock of our position and numbers. With this we did not attempt to interfere, as our decision was to stand strictly on the defensive and not to waste a single man. The men breakfasted and stood to their arms, and the hours wore on. About midday, when the men were eating their dinner, for we thought they would fight better on full stomachs, a shout of "Sorais! Sorais!" arose like thunder from the enemy's extreme right, and taking the glass I was able to clearly distinguish the Lady of the Night herself, surrounded by a glittering staff and riding slowly down the lines of her battalions. And as she went, that mighty thundering shout rolled along before her like the rolling of 10,000 chariots, or the roaring of the ocean when the gale turns suddenly and carries the noise of it to the listener's ears, till the earth shook and the air was full of the majesty of sound. Guessing that this was a prelude to the beginning of the battle, we remained still and made ready. We had not long to wait. Suddenly, like flame from a cannon's mouth, out shot two great tongue-like forces of cavalry, and came charging down the slope towards the little stream, slowly at first, but gathering speed as they came. Before they got to the stream, orders reached me from Sir Henry, who evidently feared that the shock of such a charge, if allowed to fall unbroken upon our infantry, would be too much for them, to send 5,000 sabres to meet the force opposite to me, at the moment when it began to mount the stiffest of the rise about 400 yards from our lines. This I did, remaining behind myself with the rest of my men. Off went the 5,000 horsemen, drawn up in a wedge-like form, and I must say that the general in command handled them very ably. Starting at a hand gallop, for the first 300 yards he rode straight at the tip of the tongue-shaped mass of cavalry which, numbering so far as I could judge about 8,000 sabres, was advancing to charge us. Then he suddenly swerved to the right and put on the pace, and I saw the great wedge curl round, and before the foe could check himself and turn to meet it, strike him about halfway down his length, with a crashing, rending sound like that of the breaking up of vast sheets of ice. In sank the great wedge into his heart, and as it cut its way hundreds of horsemen were thrown up on either side of it, just as the earth is thrown up by a ploughshare, or more like still, as the foaming water curls over beneath the bows of a rushing ship. In, yet in, vainly does the tongue twist its ends round in agony, like an injured snake, and strive to protect its centre. Still farther in, by heaven! Right through, and so, amid cheer after cheer from our watching thousands, back again upon the severed ends, beating them down, driving them as a gale drives spray, till at last, amidst the rushing of hundreds of riderless horses, the flashing of swords, and the victorious clamour of their pursuers, the great force crumples up like an empty glove, then turns and gallops pell-mell for safety back to its own lines. I do not think it reached them more than two-thirds as strong as when it went out 10 minutes before. The lines, which were now advancing to the attack, opened and swallowed them up, and my force returned, having only suffered a loss of about 500 men. Not much, I thought, considering the fierceness of the struggle. I could also see that the opposing bodies of cavalry on our left wing were drawing back, but how the fight went with them I do not quite know. It is as much as I can do to describe what took place immediately around me. By this time the dense masses of the enemy's left, composed almost entirely of Nasta's swordsmen, were across the little stream, and with alternate yells of "Nasta" and "Sorais," with dancing banners and gleaming swords, were swarming up towards us like ants. Again I received orders to try and check this movement, and also the main advance against the chest of our army, by means of cavalry charges, and this I did to the best of my ability by continually sending squadrons of about 1,000 sabres out against them. These squadrons did the enemy much damage, and it was a glorious sight to see them flash down the hillside and bury themselves like a living knife in the heart of the foe. But also we lost many men, for after the experience of a couple of these charges, which had drawn a sort of bloody St. Andrew's cross of dead and dying through the centre of Nasta's host, our foes no longer attempted to offer an unyielding front to their irresistible weight, but opened out to let the rush go through, throwing themselves on the ground and hamstringing hundreds of horses as they passed. And so, notwithstanding all that we could do, the enemy drew nearer, till at last he hurled himself upon Good's force of 7,500 regulars, who were drawn up to receive them in 3 strong squares. About the same time, too, an awful and heart-shaking roar told me that the main battle had closed in on the centre and extreme left. I raised myself in my stirrups and looked down to my left. So far as the eye could see there was a long dazzling shimmer of steel as the sun glanced upon falling sword and thrusting spear. To and fro swung the contending lines in that dread struggle, now giving way, now gaining a little, in the mad yet ordered confusion of attack and defence. But it was as much as I could do to keep count of what was happening to our own wing, and as for the moment the cavalry had fallen back under cover of Good's 3 squares, I had a fair view of this. Nasta's wild swordsmen were now breaking in red waves against the sullen rock-like squares. Time after time did they yell out their war cries, and hurl themselves furiously against the long triple ridges of spear points, only to be rolled back as billows are when they meet the cliff. And so for 4 long hours the battle raged, almost without a pause. And at the end of that time, if we had gained nothing, we had lost nothing. 2 attempts to turn our left flank by forcing a way through the woods by which it was protected had been defeated, and as yet Nasta's swordsmen had, notwithstanding their desperate efforts, entirely failed to break Good's three squares, though they had thinned their numbers by quite a third. As for the chest of the army, where Sir Henry was with his staff and Umslopogaas, it had suffered dreadfully, but it had held its own with honour, and the same may be said of our left battle. At last the attacks slackened, and Sorais' army drew back, having, I begin to think, had enough of it. On this point, however, I was soon undeceived, for splitting up her cavalry into comparatively small squadrons, she charged us furiously with them, all along the line, and then once more sullenly rolled her tens of thousands of sword and spearmen down upon our weakened squares and squadrons, Sorais herself directing the movement, as fearless as a lioness heading the main attack. On they came like an avalanche. I saw her golden helm gleaming in the van, our counter charges of cavalry entirely failing to check their forward sweep. Now they had struck us, and our centre bent in like a bow beneath the weight of their rush. It parted, and had not the 10,000 men in reserve charged down to its support, it must have been utterly destroyed. As for Good's three squares, they were swept backwards like boats upon an incoming tide, and the foremost one was burst into and lost half its remaining men. But the effort was too fierce and terrible to last. Suddenly the battle came, as it were, to a turning point, and for a minute or two stood still. Then it began to move toward Sorais' camp. Just then, too, Nasta's fierce and almost invincible Highlanders, either because they were disheartened by their losses or by way of a ruse, fell back, and the remains of Good's gallant squares, leaving the positions they had held for so many hours, cheered wildly and rashly followed them down the slope, whereon the swarms of swordsmen turned to envelop them, and once more flung themselves upon them with a yell. Taken thus on every side, what remained of the first square was quickly destroyed, and I perceived that the second, in which I could see Good himself mounted on a large horse, was on the point of annihilation. A few more minutes and it was broken, its streaming colours sank, and I lost sight of Good in the confused and hideous slaughter that ensued. Presently, however, a cream-coloured horse with a snow-white mane and tail burst from the ruins of the square and came rushing past me riderless and with wide streaming reins, and in it I recognized the charger that Good had been riding. Then I hesitated no longer, but taking with me half my effective cavalry force, which now amounted to between 4,000 and 5,000 men, I commended myself to God, and without waiting for orders, I charged straight down upon Nasta's swordsmen. Seeing me coming, and being warned by the thunder of my horse's hoofs, the majority of them faced round, and gave us a right warm welcome. Not an inch would they yield. In vain did we hack and trample them down as we ploughed a broad red furrow through their thousands. They seemed to re-arise by hundreds, driving their terrible sharp swords into our horses or severing their hamstrings, and then hacking the troopers who came to the ground with them almost into pieces. My horse was speedily killed under me, but luckily I had a fresh one, my own favourite, a coal-black mare Nyleptha had given me, being held in reserve behind, and on this I afterwards mounted. Meanwhile I had to get along as best I could, for I was pretty well lost sight of by my men in the mad confusion of the moment. My voice, of course, could not be heard in the midst of the clanging of steel and the shrieks of rage and agony. Presently I found myself mixed up with the remnants of the square, which had formed round its leader, Good, and was fighting desperately for existence. I stumbled against somebody, and glancing down caught sight of Good's eyeglass. He had been beaten to his knee. Over him was a great fellow swinging a heavy sword. Somehow I managed to run the man through with the sime I had taken from the Masai, whose hand I had cut off. But as I did so he dealt me a frightful blow on the left side and breast with the sword, and though my chain shirt saved my life, I felt that I was badly hurt. For a minute I fell on to my hands and knees among the dead and dying, and turned sick and faint. When I came to again, I saw that Nasta's spearmen, or rather those of them who remained, were retreating back across the stream, and that Good was there by me, smiling sweetly. "Near go that," he shouted, "but all's well that ends well." I assented, but I could not help feeling that it had not ended well for me. I was sorely hurt. Just then we saw the smaller bodies of cavalry stationed on our extreme right and left, and which were now reinforced by the 3,000 sabres which we had held in reserve, flash out like arrows from their posts and fall upon the disordered flanks of Sorais' forces, and that charge decided the issue of the battle. In another minute or two the enemy was in slow and sullen retreat across the little stream, where they once more reformed. Then came another lull, during which I managed to get a second horse, and received my orders to advance from Sir Henry, and then with one fierce deep-throated roar, with a waving of banners and a wide flashing of steel, the remains of our army took the offensive and began to sweep down, slowly indeed, but irresistibly, from the positions they had so gallantly held all day. At last it was our turn to attack. On we moved, over the piled-up masses of dead and dying, and were approaching the stream, when suddenly I perceived an extraordinary sight. Galloping wildly towards us, his arms tightly clasped around his horse's neck, against which his blanched cheek was tightly pressed, was a man arrayed in the full costume of a Zu-Vendi general, but in whom, as he came nearer, I recognized none other than our lost Alphonse. It was impossible even then to mistake those curling mustachios. In a minute he was tearing through our ranks and narrowly escaped being cut down, till at last somebody caught his horse's bridle, and he was brought to me just as a momentary halt occurred in our advance to allow what remained of our shattered squares to form into line. "Ah, monsieur," he gasped out in a voice that was nearly inarticulate with fright, "grace to the sky, it is you! Ah, what I have endured! But you win, monsieur, you win! They fly, the lâche! But listen, monsieur, I forget, it is no good. The Queen is to be murdered tomorrow at the first light in the palace of Milosis. Her guards will leave their posts, and the priests are going to kill her. Ah, yes, they little thought it, but I was ensconced beneath a banner, and I heard it all." "What?" I said, horror-struck. "What do you mean?" "What I say, monsieur. That devil of a Nasta, he went last night to settle the affair with the Archbishop (Agon). The guard will leave open the little gate leading from the great stair and go away, and Nasta and Agon's priests will come in and kill her. Themselves they would not kill her." "Come with me," I said, and shouting to the staff officer next to me to take over the command, I snatched his bridle and galloped as hard as I could for the spot, between a quarter and half a mile off, where I saw the royal pennon flying, and where I knew that I should find Curtis if he were still alive. On we tore, our horses clearing heaps of dead and dying men, and splashing through pools of blood, on past the long broken lines of spearmen to where, mounted on the white stallion Nyleptha had sent to him as a parting gift, I saw Sir Henry's form towering above the generals who surrounded him. Just as we reached him the advance began again. A bloody cloth was bound around his head, but I saw that his eye was as bright and keen as ever. Beside him was old Umslopogaas, his axe red with blood, but looking quite fresh and uninjured. "What's wrong, Quatermain?" he shouted. "Everything. There is a plot to murder the Queen tomorrow at dawn. Alphonse here, who has just escaped from Sorais, has overheard it all," and I rapidly repeated to him what the Frenchman had told me. Curtis's face turned deadly pale and his jaw dropped. "At dawn!" he gasped, "and it is now sunset. It dawns before 4, and we are nearly 100 miles off. 9 hours at the outside. What is to be done?" An idea entered into my head. "Is that horse of yours fresh?" I said. "Yes, I have only just got on to him when my last was killed, and he has been fed." "So was mine. Get off him, and let Umslopogaas mount. He can ride well. We will be at Milosis before dawn, or if we are not, well, we cannot help it. No, no, it is impossible for you to leave now. You would be seen, and it would turn the fate of the battle. It is not half won yet. The soldiers would think you were making a bolt of it. Quick now." In a moment he was down, and at my bidding Umslopogaas sprang into the empty saddle. "Now farewell," I said. "Send 1,000 horsemen with remounts after us in an hour if possible. Stay, dispatch a general to the left wing to take over the command and explain my absence." "You will do your best to save her, Quatermain," he said in a broken voice. "Ay, that I will. Go on, you are being left behind." He cast one glance at us, and accompanied by his staff galloped off to join the advance, which by this time was fording the little brook that now ran red with the blood of the fallen. As for Umslopogaas and myself, we left that dreadful field as arrows leave a bow, and in a few minutes had passed right out of the sight of slaughter, the smell of blood, and the turmoil and shouting, which only came to our ears as a faint, far-off roaring like the sound of distant breakers. End of chapter 20. The LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Allan Quatermain by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 21. Away! Away! At the top of the rise, we halted for a second to breathe our horses, and turning, glanced at the battle beneath us, which, illumined as it was by the fierce rays of the sinking sun, staining the whole scene red, looked from where we were more like some wild Titanic picture than an actual hand-to-hand combat. The distinguishing scenic effect from that distance was the countless distinct flashes of light reflected from the swords and spears. Otherwise, the panorama was not so grand as might have been expected. The great green lap of sward in which the struggle was being fought out, the bold round outline of the hills behind, and the wide sweep of the plain beyond seemed to dwarf it.
and what was tremendous enough when one was in it grew insignificant when viewed from the distance. But is it not thus with all the affairs and doings of our race, about which we blow the loud trumpet and make such a fuss and worry? How utterly ant-like and morally and physically insignificant must they seem to the calm eyes that watch them from the arching depths above. "We win the day, Macumazahn," said old Umslopogaas, taking in the whole situation with a glance of his practised eye. "Look, the Lady of the Night's forces give on every side. There is no stiffness left in them. They bend like hot iron. They are fighting with but half a heart. But, alas, the battle will in a manner be drawn, for the darkness gathers, and the regiments will not be able to follow and slay." And he shook his head sadly. "But," he added, "I do not think that they will fight again. We have fed them with too strong a meat. Ah, it is well to have lived. At last I have seen a fight worth seeing." By this time we were on our way again, and as we went side by side I told him what our mission was, and how that, if it failed, all the lives that had been lost that day would have been lost in vain. "Ah," he said, "nigh on 100 miles, and no horses but these, and to be there before the dawn. Well, away, away! Man can but try, Macumazahn, and mayhap we shall be there in time to split that old witch-finder's (Agon's) skull for him. Once he wanted to burn us, the old rain-maker, did he? And now he would set a snare for my mother, Nyleptha, would he? Good! So sure as my name is the name of the woodpecker, so surely be my mother alive or dead will I split him to the beard. Ay, by T'Chaka's head I swear it." And he shook Inkosi-kaas as he galloped. By now the darkness was closing in, but fortunately there would be a moon later, and the road was good. On we sped through the twilight. The two splendid horses we bestrode had got their wind by this, and were sweeping along with a wide, steady stride that neither failed nor varied for mile upon mile. Down the side of slopes we galloped, across wide vales that stretched to the foot of far-off hills. Nearer and nearer grew the blue hills. Now we were travelling up their steeps, and now we were over and passing towards others that sprang up like visions in the far, faint distance beyond. On, never pausing or drawing rein, through the perfect quiet of the night, that was set like a song to the falling music of our horses' hoofs. On, past deserted villages, where only some forgotten starving dog howled a melancholy welcome. On, past lonely moated dwellings. On, through the white patchy moonlight that lay coldly upon the wide bosom of the earth, as though there was no warmth in it. On, knee to knee, for hour after hour. We spake not, but bent us forward on the necks of those two glorious horses, and listened to their deep, long-drawn breaths as they filled their great lungs, and to the regular unfaltering ring of their round hoofs. Grim and black indeed did old Umslopogaas look beside me, mounted upon the great white horse, like Death in the Revelation of St. John, as now and again lifting his fierce set face he gazed out along the road, and pointed with his axe towards some distant rise or house. And so on, still on, without break or pause for hour after hour. At last I felt that even the splendid animal that I rode was beginning to give out. I looked at my watch. It was nearly midnight, and we were considerably more than halfway. On the top of a rise was a little spring which I remembered because I had slept by it a few nights before, and here I motioned to Umslopogaas to pull up, having determined to give the horses and ourselves 10 minutes to breathe in. He did so, and we dismounted, that is to say, Umslopogaas did, and then helped me off, for what with fatigue, stiffness, and the pain of my wound, I could not do so for myself. And then the gallant horses stood panting there, resting first one leg and then another, while the sweat fell drip, drip from them, and the steam rose and hung in pale clouds in the still night air. Leaving Umslopogaas to hold the horses, I hobbled to the spring and drank deep of its sweet waters. I had had nothing but a single mouthful of wine since midday, when the battle began, and I was parched up, though my fatigue was too great to allow me to feel hungry. Then, having laved my fevered head and hands, I returned, and the Zulu went and drank. Next we allowed the horses to take a couple of mouthfuls each, no more. And oh, what a struggle we had to get the poor beasts away from the water. There were yet 2 minutes, and I employed it in hobbling up and down to try and relieve my stiffness, and in inspecting the condition of the horses. My mare, gallant animal though she was evidently much distressed. She hung her head, and her eyes looked sick and dull. But Daylight, Nyleptha's glorious horse, who, if he is served aright, should, like the steeds who saved great Rameses in his need, feed for the rest of his days out of a golden manger, was still, comparatively speaking, fresh, notwithstanding the fact that he had had by far the heavier weight to carry. He was tucked up, indeed, and his legs were weary, but his eye was bright and clear, and he held his shapely head up and gazed out into the darkness round him in a way that seemed to say that whoever failed, he was good for those 45 miles that yet lay between us and Milosis. Then Umslopogaas helped me into the saddle, and, vigorous old savage that he was, vaulted into his own without touching a stirrup, and we were off once more, slowly at first, till the horses got into their stride, and then more swiftly. So we passed over another 10 miles, and then came a long weary rise of some 6 or 7 miles, and 3 times did my poor black mare nearly come to the ground with me. But on the top she seemed to gather herself together, and rattled down the slope with long convulsive strides, breathing in gasps. We did that 3 or 4 miles more swiftly than any since we had started on our wild ride, but I felt it to be a last effort, and I was right. Suddenly my poor horse took the bit between her teeth, and bolted furiously along a stretch of level ground for some 300 or 400 yards, and then, with 2 or 3 jerky strides, pulled herself up and fell with a crash right on to her head, I rolling myself free as she did so. As I struggled to my feet, the brave beast raised her head and looked at me with piteous bloodshot eyes, and then her head dropped with a groan, and she was dead. Her heart was broken. Umslopogaas pulled up beside the carcass, and I looked at him in dismay. There were still more than 20 miles to do by dawn, and how were we to do it with one horse? It seemed hopeless. but I had forgotten the old Zulu's extraordinary running powers. Without a single word he sprang from the saddle and began to hoist me into it. "What wilt thou do?" I asked. "Run," he answered, seizing my stirrup leather. Then off we went again, almost as fast as before. And oh, the relief it was to me to get that change of horses. Anybody who has ever ridden against time will know what it meant. Daylight sped along at a long stretching hand gallop, giving the gaunt Zulu a lift at every stride. It was a wonderful thing to see old Umslopogaas run mile after mile, his lips slightly parted and his nostrils agape like the horse's. Every 5 miles or so we stopped for a few minutes to let him get his breath, and then flew on again. "Canst thou go farther?" I said at the third of these stoppages, "or shall I leave thee to follow me?" He pointed with his axe to a dim mass before us. It was the Temple of the Sun, now not more than 5 miles away. "I reach it or I die," he gasped. Oh, that last 5 miles! The skin was rubbed from the inside of my legs, and every movement of my horse gave me anguish. Nor was that all. I was exhausted with toil, want of food and sleep, and also suffering very much from the blow I had received on my left side. It seemed as though a piece of bone or something was slowly piercing into my lung. Poor Daylight, too, was pretty nearly finished, and no wonder. But there was a smell of dawn in the air, and we might not stay. Better that all 3 of us should die upon the road than that we should linger while there was life in us. The air was thick and heavy, as it sometimes is before dawn breaks, and, another infallible sign in certain parts of Zu-Vendis that sunrise is at hand, hundreds of little spiders pendant on the end of long tough webs were floating about in it. These early rising creatures, or rather their webs, caught upon the horses and our own forms by scores, and as we had neither the time nor the energy to brush them off, we rushed along covered with hundreds of long grey threads that streamed out a yard or more behind us, and a very strange appearance they must have given us. And now before us are the huge brazen gates of the outer wall of the frowning city, and a new and horrible doubt strikes me. What if they will not let us in? "Open! Open!" I shout imperiously, at the same time giving the royal password. "Open! Open! A messenger! A messenger with tidings of the war!" "What news?" cried the guard. "And who art thou that ridest so madly? And who is that whose tongue lolls out?" And it actually did. "And who runs by thee like a dog by a chariot?" "It is the Lord Macumazahn, and with him is his dog, his black dog. Open! Open! I bring tidings." The great gates ran back on their rollers, and the drawbridge fell with a rattling crash, and we dashed on through the one and over the other. "What news, my lord? What news?" cried the guard. "Incubu rolls Sorais back as the wind a cloud," I answered, and was gone. One more effort, gallant horse, and yet more gallant man. So fall not now, Daylight, and hold thy life in thee for 15 short minutes more, O Zulu war dog, and ye shall both live for ever in the annals of the land. On, clattering through the sleeping streets. We are passing the Flower Temple now. 1 mile more. Only 1 little mile. Hold on. Keep your life in thee. See the houses run past of themselves. Up, good horse, up! There, but 50 yards now. Ah, you see your stables, and stagger on gallantly. Thank God, the palace at last. And see, the first arrows of the dawn are striking on the temple's golden dome. End note. Of course, the roof of the temple, being so high, caught the light some time before the breaking of the dawn. Allan Quatermain. But shall I get in here, or is the deed done and the way barred? Once more I give the password and shout, "Open! Open!" No answer, and my heart grows very faint. Again I call, and this time a single voice replies, and to my joy I recognize it as belonging to Kara, a fellow officer of Nyleptha's guards, a man I know to be as honest as the light. Indeed, the same whom Nyleptha had sent to arrest Sorais on the day she fled to the temple. "Is it thou, Kara?" I cry. "I am Macumazahn. Bid the guard let down the bridge and throw wide the gate. Quick! Quick!" Then followed a space that seemed to me endless, but at length the bridge fell and one half of the gate opened, and we got into the courtyard, where at last poor daylight fell down beneath me, as I thought, dead. Except Kara, there was nobody to be seen, and his look was wild, and his garments were all torn. He had opened the gate and let down the bridge alone, and was now getting them up and shut again, as, owing to a very ingenious arrangement of cranks and levers, one man could easily do, and indeed generally did so. "Where are the guard?" I gasped, fearing his answer as I never feared anything before. "I know not," he answered. "2 hours ago, as I slept, was I seized and bound by the watch under me, and but now, this very moment, have I freed myself with my teeth. I fear, I greatly fear, that we are betrayed." His words gave me fresh energy. Catching him by the arm, I staggered, followed by Umslopogaas, who reeled after us like a drunken man, through the courtyards, up the great hall, which was silent as the grave, towards the Queen's sleeping place. We reached the first ante-room. No guards. The second. Still no guards. Oh, surely the thing was done. We were too late after all, too late. The silence and solitude of those great chambers was dreadful, and weighed me down like an evil dream. On, right into Nyleptha's chamber we rushed, and staggered, sick at heart, fearing the very worst. We saw there was a light in it, ay, and a figure bearing the light. Oh, thank God, it is the White Queen herself, the Queen unharmed. There she stands in her night gear, roused by the clatter of our coming from her bed, the heaviness of sleep yet in her eyes, and a red blush of fear and shame mantling her lovely breast and cheek. "What is it?" she cries. "What means this? O Macumazahn, is it thou? Why lookest thou so wildly? Thou comest as one bearing evil tidings. And my lord, oh, tell me not my lord is dead, not dead," she wailed, wringing her white hands. "I left Incubu wounded, but leading the advance against Sorais, last night at sundown. Therefore let thy heart have rest. Sorais is beaten back all along her lines, and thy arms prevail." "I knew it," she cried in triumph. "I knew that he would win. And they called him Outlander, and shook their wise heads when I gave him the command. Last night at sundown, sayest thou, and it is not yet dawn. Surely "Throw a cloak around thee, Nyleptha," I broke in, "and give us wine to drink, ay, and call thy maidens quick if thou wouldst save thyself alive. Nay, stay not." Thus adjured, she ran and called through the curtains towards some room beyond, and then hastily put on her sandals and a thick cloak, by which time a dozen or so half-dressed women were pouring into the room. "Follow us and be silent," I said to them as they gazed with wondering eyes, clinging one to another. So we went into the first anteroom. "Now," I said, "give us wine to drink and food if ye have it, for we are near to death." The room was used as a mess room for the officers of the guards, and from a cupboard some flagons of wine and some cold flesh were brought forth, and Umslopogaas and I drank, and felt life flow back into our veins as the good red wine went down. "Hark to me, Nyleptha," I said, as I put down the empty tankard. "Hast thou here among these thy waiting ladies any two of discretion?" "Ay," she said, "surely." "Then bid them go out by the side entrance to any citizens whom thou canst bethink thee of as men loyal to thee, and pray them come armed, with all honest folk that they can gather, to rescue thee from death. Nay, question not. Do as I say, and quickly. Kara here will let out the maids." She turned, and selecting two of the crowd of damsels, repeated the words I had uttered, giving them besides a list of the names of the men to whom each should run. "Go swiftly and secretly, go for your very lives," I added. In another moment they had left with Kara, whom I told to rejoin us at the door leading from the great courtyard on to the stairway as soon as he had made fast behind the girls. Thither, too, Umslopogaas and I made our way, followed by the Queen and her women. As we went we tore off mouthfuls of food, and between them I told her what I knew of the danger which encompassed her, and how we found Kara, and how all the guards and men servants were gone, and she was alone with her women in that great place. And she told me, too, that a rumour had spread through the town that our army had been utterly destroyed, and that Sorais was marching in triumph on Milosis, and how in consequence thereof all men had fallen away from her. Though all this takes some time to tell, we had not been but 6 or 7 minutes in the palace, and notwithstanding that the golden roof of the temple, being very lofty, was ablaze with the rays of the rising sun, it was not yet dawn, nor would be for another 10 minutes. We were in the courtyard now, and here my wound pained me so that I had to take Nyleptha's arm, while Umslopogaas rolled along after us, eating as he went. Now we were across it, and had reached the narrow doorway through the palace wall that opened on to the mighty stair. I looked through and stood aghast, as well I might. The door was gone, and so were the outer gates of bronze, entirely gone. They had been taken from their hinges, and, as we afterwards found, hurled from the stairway to the ground 200 feet beneath. There in front of us was the semicircular standing space, about twice the size of a large oval dining table, and the 10 curved black marble steps leading on to the main stair. And that was all. End of chapter 21.